A man's jaw gets broken. The referee doesn't see it. The linesman doesn't see it. The cameras don't catch it. And the only reason the world finds out is because the man never gets back up. Bucharest, 1984. Second leg of a European Cup semi-final. And an entire stadium is about to try to make one man pay for a punch nobody else in the ground even witnessed. 7 moments. 7 people who found out what happens when you test Graeme Souness. Let's go back to where it started. Anfield, mid-April 1984. Liverpool are hosting Dinamo Bucharest in the first leg, and their captain is getting worked over the way captains got worked over in the 1980s, shirt pulled, studs raked, the usual invisible fouls that never made it into a match report. One player in particular, Dynamo's own captain, Lika Muvola, won't leave him alone. Tugging his shirt every time he runs into the box. Following him off the ball. Testing him. Graeme Souness had a limit. And that night, Muvola found it. He swings round. One punch. Muvola goes down like he's been shot. Play carries on because the officials are looking the other way, at the attack developing near the box. By the time anyone stops to check on him, he's still on the ground. Doctors get to him. His jaw is broken. Liverpool win the game 1-0, and Souness walks off with nobody, publicly, any the wiser. For 2 weeks, that's the story. A dirty little secret buried under a European Cup scoreline. Then Romania finds out. By the time Liverpool land in Bucharest for the second leg, the story has traveled. The Dinamo players know exactly what happened to their captain, and exactly who did it. So do the fans. This isn't just a hostile away leg anymore, this is personal, in front of 80,000 people who have had 2 weeks to get angry about it. And here's where most players would have folded. The Dinamo team spend 90 minutes trying to get to him. Surrounding him off the ball. Kicking him early, kicking him late. Every stoppage in play, someone finds a reason to get in his face. Souness later described it himself, plainly, a marker following him everywhere, pulling at him, needling him, match after match, and this one man refusing to be moved off it. He doesn't retaliate again. He doesn't need to. He absorbs it. 90 minutes of a stadium trying to break him, and he comes out the other side having orchestrated Liverpool into the final, playing so well under that pressure that he's named man of the match, in the away end, in the country he'd just made an enemy of 2 weeks earlier. Think about the sheer nerve that takes. Most players, dropped into that kind of hostility, shrink. They go missing for 90 minutes, try to hide on the ball, wait for the final whistle. Souness does the opposite. He gets more visible as the game goes on, not less, orchestrating, organizing, refusing to let a stadium full of anger dictate how he plays. It's the first data point in a pattern that's going to repeat itself over and over across this list. Pressure doesn't shrink this man. It seems to switch something on. Liverpool go on to win the European Cup that year. Souness scores in the final shootout. But the version of that story people actually remember isn't the trophy. It's the jaw. It's the idea that you could throw an entire hostile nation at this man for 90 minutes and he'd still be standing at the final whistle, unbothered, job done. That's player 1. And if you think that was just one wild night in Eastern Europe, stick around, because that same instinct, the refusal to be intimidated, the willingness to go further than the man opposite him, follows Graeme Souness through 5 decades. Through midfields. Through dressing rooms. Through a football club he ran as a manager. And eventually, into a television studio, against a man just as hard as he is. Go back before the European Cups, before the captaincy, to English football in the 1970s, and you'll find the proving ground. This was an era when midfield wasn't a position, it was a war zone, and the 2 men who ran that war zone in Yorkshire were Leeds United's Billy Bremner and Norman Hunter, a pair so feared for their tackling that Hunter's own nickname was, "Bites Your Legs." These weren't rivals you outplayed. These were men you survived. A young Souness, coming through at a time when Leeds represented the old guard of hard, uncompromising English football, had to go through both of them, repeatedly, across a decade of fixtures that had nothing to do with entertainment and everything to do with who was going to leave the pitch standing taller. And here's the part that actually matters for the story we're building: he didn't just survive Bremner and Hunter. He matched them physically, and then did something they never managed: he added range, composure, a footballing brain underneath the aggression. Where Bremner and Hunter were pure combat, Souness became something more complete. The heir apparent, if you want to call it that, except the old guard didn't hand him the title. He took it, tackle by tackle, across some of the most brutal midfield battles English football has ever produced. That matters for the rest of this story, because it tells you where the version of Souness who walked into Bucharest actually came from. He wasn't born into that Anfield dressing room already the hardest man in the building. He earned it, years earlier, against two of the most fearsome midfielders the English game has ever produced, on pitches with no protection for anybody and referees who let almost everything go. By the time Movola tried to test him in 1984, Souness had already spent the better part of a decade being tested by better, meaner opponents than a Romanian international captain. That's not an excuse for what happened in that first leg. It's context, because everything that follows in this list only makes sense once you understand that the toughness wasn't a costume he put on for big European nights. It was the foundation the entire career was built on. Now let's talk about what that toughness actually protected, because this is where the story stops being about violence for its own sake. Liverpool's training ground, Melwood, late 1970s. A young Howard Gale, the first black player to sign professionally for Liverpool, is out on the training pitch, still trying to break into a first team stacked with internationals. And one of the club's own legends, veteran defender Tommy Smith, the so-called Anfield Iron, starts on him. Racial abuse. Repeated. The kind of language that got shrugged off in dressing rooms of that era because nobody senior enough was willing to call it out. One day, Gale finally snaps back at him, warns him to watch himself. Smith doesn't stop. And this is the moment that matters. Souness, the club captain, the hardest man in that dressing room by reputation, someone who had every incentive to side with a fellow senior pro over a young reserve, walks straight over to Gale in front of everyone and backs him. Tells him he did the right thing. Tells him Smith deserved it. Gale would later call it the moment Tommy Smith stopped being a hero to him. He'd also call Souness a true leader for what he did next: nothing dramatic, no fight, no press conference, just a senior player publicly siding with the target of racism over the man handing it out, at a time when almost nobody in English football did that. Context matters here too. Smith wasn't some fringe figure Gale could just avoid. He was a European Cup winner, a Liverpool institution, a man senior enough in that dressing room that plenty of players would have looked the other way rather than risk the fallout of crossing him. Souness didn't have to get involved at all. Nobody would have blinked if the club captain had simply stayed out of a dispute between a legend and a reserve trying to break through. He chose to get involved anyway, and he chose the side that had nothing to offer him politically inside that dressing room. That's the detail that separates this one from the rest of the list. It's the one confrontation on here where Souness wasn't defending himself, or even a close friend. He was defending a teammate he barely knew yet, purely because it was the right thing to do. This isn't just a man who liked confrontation. This is a man who chose, consistently, which fights were actually worth having, and who they were for. Now, let me be fair for a second, because it would be easy to build this entire video into a hero's tale and stop there. Souness' reputation off the pitch isn't spotless. Some of what got him this reputation wouldn't survive 5 seconds of scrutiny in the modern game, a sport now covered by 40 cameras, VR replays, and a social media pile-on machine that didn't exist in 1984. A broken jaw missed by a referee is, by any current standard, a serious violent conduct case. This was a rougher decade for football, and Souness was, by his own admission decades later, a foolish young man in some of these moments, not a calculated one. So it's worth holding both things at once: the man who protected a teammate from racism, and the man who broke another player's jaw and, by his own account, acted on frustration rather than principle. But here's where the story pivots back, because the pattern doesn't stop at Melwood. It shows up again in the club's biggest rivalries, and it shows up in a way that has nothing to do with retaliation and everything to do with responsibility. The 1983-84 season. Liverpool are mid-title charge, and a Manchester United fixture turns into a defining injury of the year. Kenny Dalglish, Souness' closest friend in that dressing room, comes away from a clash with United defender Kevin Moran with a fractured cheekbone. 8 weeks out. One of the club's most important players, taken out of a title run by a single collision. Now, put yourself in that dressing room. Your captain. Your best friend in football. Carried off with a broken face. What does Graeme Souness do? He doesn't let it go quietly. Reports from that era describe a Liverpool captain who made his feelings about the incident, and about Moran, very clear in the aftermath, not as a wild man losing control, but as exactly what a captain is supposed to be when someone tries to take out his best player. Protective. Immovable. The line between aggression and leadership gets blurry fast in football from this period, and Souness spent his career living directly on that blur. It's worth remembering what kind of season this was for Liverpool. A genuine title race, a squad chasing an unprecedented treble, and their most gifted forward suddenly sidelined for 2 months by one collision. Every captain in that situation says the right things to the press. Not every captain makes the opposing dressing room feel the weight of what just happened. Souness did both, publicly composed, privately unmistakable about where he stood. That's the version of hard man that gets left out of the highlight reels, not just the willingness to throw a punch, but the willingness to make sure everyone in the room knows exactly why. There's a pattern you should be noticing by now. Every single one of these confrontations has someone or something worth defending behind it. A teammate under racial abuse. A best friend with a broken face. A captaincy that came with the unwritten job description of, nobody touches my players and gets away with it. Which brings us to the version of Souness that should scare you more than any of this, not the player anymore. The manager. Newcastle United, 2004. Graeme Souness, now in the dugout, has been in the job barely a month, and he's already about to have the defining bust-up of his management career, with his own player. Newcastle have just been beaten by Charlton. Souness has substituted striker Craig Bellamy during the game, and as Bellamy walks off, the TV cameras catch him muttering something under his breath in Souness' direction. Souness doesn't clock it live. He gets shown the footage afterward. And when he calls the squad in to deal with it, Bellamy, despite being warned beforehand not to escalate things, starts protesting that there was no issue at all. That denial is what lights the fuse. According to accounts from teammates who were in the room, Souness reminds Bellamy exactly who he's talking to, a player who won trophies at the highest level of the European game, standing in front of a striker who'd just sworn at him and was now denying it to his face. It boils over into a physical confrontation, Souness going for Bellamy, and it takes Alan Shearer, Newcastle's own captain, and a man not exactly known for backing down himself, physically pulling his manager off a player to stop it going further. Think about that for a second. It takes Alan Shearer to be the voice of reason in the room. That's how far this went. Bellamy would later admit the fallout from that bust-up never really healed. He was sold on. The incident followed both men around English football for years afterward, brought up on podcasts and interview shows nearly 2 decades later, because it's one of those stories football never quite lets go of, a manager, a month into the job, already drawing a line in the sand that said, I don't care who you are, you don't disrespect me and think there's no consequence. And this wasn't a one-off flash of temper that got buried and forgotten. Newcastle's dressing room in that era was already a combustible place. Plenty has been written about the atmosphere Souness inherited, a squad with egos and cliques that had gone unmanaged for years. He walked into that environment and, within weeks, decided the way to establish control was to make an example out of the most talented player in the building. Whether that was smart management or just Souness being Souness is still argued about today. What isn't argued about is what it says about the man. Even with a job on the line, even a month into a new role, he wasn't capable of letting a slight go unanswered. Is that the healthiest way to run a football club? Almost certainly not, and Newcastle's results under Souness in that spell would suggest the discipline-first approach had limits. But as evidence for the thesis of this video, that Graeme Souness does not, under any circumstances, back down, it's about as clean a data point as you'll find. Player. Captain. Manager. The job title changes. The instinct never does. And that instinct didn't retire when he did. Fast forward to November 2022. Souness is no longer wearing a tracksuit, he's in a television studio for ITV, part of the punditry team covering the World Cup in Qatar, sitting next to a man who might be the only pundit in Britain as uncompromising as he is, Roy Keane. Argentina are playing Saudi Arabia in the tournament opener. 8 minutes in, Argentina are awarded a penalty, a soft-looking foul, the kind of decision that splits a room instantly. And at halftime, presenter Laura Woods turns to her panel for a verdict, and what follows is an analysis. It's a standoff. Souness is unequivocal, it's a penalty, full stop, a directive straight from the referees on exactly that kind of contact. Keane isn't having it, insisting the decision will only encourage more diving, more players hitting the deck for contact that shouldn't be rewarded. Neither man gives an inch. Souness tells Keane, on live television, to let someone else get a word in, because he might actually learn something. Keane doesn't blink. The exchange gets sharper, quicker, more pointed, both of them talking over each other while the rest of the panel just watches it happen. Presenter Laura Woods, sitting between them, looks like she's refereeing a fixture she never signed up for. Joe Cole, the third man on the panel, ends up smiling through most of it, half amused, half bracing for it to go further. It doesn't, but for a few seconds, it's genuinely unclear whether two of the most combative midfielders of their generations are about to turn a halftime analysis segment into something else entirely, live, in front of millions of people watching a World Cup they'd already spent the pre-match segment tearing into for its human rights record. That's the layer people forget about this clip, it wasn't just two egos colliding over a penalty. It was two men who'd already been arguing, passionately, about something far bigger than a football decision, and neither of them had any interest in cooling off before the second half kicked in. It's not a fight. Nobody's throat gets grabbed this time, nobody needs pulling apart by Alan Shearer. But it's the same DNA as everything that came before it, a man who has never once, in 5 decades of football, been willing to sit quietly and let someone else's opinion stand unchallenged in the room. The stakes went from a broken jaw in Bucharest to a penalty decision on live TV, and the response is identical. Hold the ground. Don't blink first. So here's what you're actually looking at when you line all 7 of these up. A punch that broke a man's jaw in a European Cup semi-final, and the 90 minutes of hostility he absorbed without flinching 2 weeks later. A decade of trench warfare against Leeds' hardest midfielders that built the platform for everything after it. A young black teammate backed publicly against racist abuse from a senior player, at a moment almost nobody else in that dressing room was willing to speak up. A best friend's broken cheekbone answered with a captain's fury. A player who swore at him and denied it, met with a manager who had to be physically restrained. A broadcaster half his age going toe-to-toe with him on live television over a penalty in Qatar, refusing to yield an inch either. 7 names. 7 completely different sets of circumstances, a Romanian international, 2 of Leeds' hardest midfielders, a racist veteran defender, an Irish centre-back, a rebellious young striker, and finally a fellow pundit who built his own entire reputation on refusing to back down. If this were just one story, you could write it off as a single wild night. 2 stories, maybe a coincidence. But 7, spread across 50 years of a life spent in football, stop being a coincidence and start being a character trait, the one through line that connects a teenager surviving Billy Bremner's tackles to a 60-something pundit refusing to let Roy Keane finish a sentence. Different arenas. Different decades. Different opponents. Same man, doing the exact same thing every single time, refusing to be the one who backs down. Is all of it defensible by today's standards? No. A punch that breaks a jaw and goes unpunished because nobody's watching is not something football would, or should, wave through in 2026, not with the number of cameras trained on every blade of grass now, not with the scrutiny that follows every flashpoint within minutes of it happening. Some of what built this reputation belongs to a rougher, less accountable era of the sport, and Souness himself has admitted as much about the moments where frustration got the better of him. But strip away the punches and the shouting matches, and what's actually left across 7 names and 5 decades is something closer to a through line than a highlight reel of violence, a man who consistently decided which fights were worth having, and then had every single one of them without hesitation, whether the opponent was a Romanian captain, a racist teammate, a Premier League striker, or Roy Keane with a live microphone in his hand. There's a reason this list runs through 5 decades and never once finds a moment where Souness simply lets something slide. Careers end. Teammates change. Job titles change, from midfielder to captain to manager to pundit. The one constant across all of it is a man who treats backing down as something closer to a personal failure than a reasonable option. Whether you find that admirable or exhausting probably says more about your own relationship with confrontation than it does about him. So here's the question for you. Is that legacy, 5 decades of refusing to be intimidated, on the pitch, in the dugout, and now in the studio, something football should still respect? Or is Graeme Souness a relic of an era the sport is better off having left behind? Drop your take in the comments, I read every one of them. A like genuinely helps this channel more than you'd think. And subscribe if you want more of these deep dives into the players and moments that actually built the game's reputation for controversy. Football at this scale is never just a tournament. It's a moment in time.